got some
Yeah,
extra
or,
chairs.
you know, do what you did at school, which is sit next to people, be friendly, move up. Yes. I mean, it's kind of awkward because I'm going to be advancing the slides and they're going to be watching the slides. So we're all going to be discussing. So the bit.ly on this page is where you can get access to the slides and all the links. It's a Google Doc. So if it loads on your machine, you can follow along. If it doesn't, you can copy it down now and find all the links later. Right, so we're just going to give you a second to copy that down if you're interested. And then we'll go into our own introductions. We'll give you a little bit more background on why we complement each other as a general.
We can put that bit.ly up again.
Oh, yeah, let's do that. All right, introductions. So, Anne, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. So this panel is actually a combination of two presentations. One from Edward specifically and Missouri and the Reynolds Journalism Institute, which he can speak to in a sec, but on born digital news preservation at news organizations of all shapes and sizes, colors and stripes. And he has, this is like a major charge of his position at RJI. And so to that end, he's done an initial survey that we're going to talk through some of the results of today, and then has a lot of stuff in the works. At the same time, some of us, including Leslie and Aurelia and myself, have been working on specifically news app archiving and thinking about interactives and how some of the kind of most technically involved projects are complicated when it comes to archiving and just fundamentally not being archived. And that initially spread out of a meeting mostly of journalists. And I think that's the common thread here, is that journalists are realizing that their work is being lost at a greater rate in some ways than ever before. And so there was a news food event last November when a bunch of journalists got together for an unconference session on called something like "I don't want my work to die," and basically I'll just put up links one by one of the projects that they've worked on that don't really exist anymore or that are just shells of what they once were. So those are sort of the two complementary perspectives that we have bringing to this, and I wanted to say a quick word about the work at Missouri.
I'm Edward McCain, and I have the great title of Digital Curator of Journalism, which I hadn't ever seen before, and that's what attracted me to the position. It came from a major loss of news content at the Columbia Missourian, which is the paper that served Columbia and the Columbia area, Columbia, Missouri area, since 1908 with the founding of the school there. And so they sort of learned the hard way that born digital news content is extremely easy to lose. It can be gone in a fraction of a second. And in this case, it was on an obsolete CMS. The CMS was no longer supported by the vendor. There was no way to retrieve the content, at least, that would be economical. I wasn't there at the time, but this position was created kind of as a reaction to that. And RJI, Reynolds Journalism Institute, is affiliated with the School of Journalism. And also, part of my position is paid for by University of Missouri Libraries, which obviously has an interest in preserving cultural heritage.
And then I'll just say, I'm Anne. I'm the co-founder of Pop-Up Archive, which is a set of tools for managing digital audio. Specifically, we designed it to help preserve and create access to digital audio. Oral history, we initially worked with a lot of public radio producers. We worked with all kinds of oral history archives and universities, partnered with the Public Radio Exchange. And if you want to talk about audio, come find me.
So the four of us, along with about 40 of our now close friends and colleagues, all participated in we originally started to think of it as a hackathon, as we realized we couldn't necessarily do anything in a single day around this problem. With the NICAR meeting in the museum back in March of this year, and we met to talk about what are news apps. So this was a gathering of archivists, librarians, journalists and fellows, scholars, researchers, who all brought together the use cases of what are these objects that we're trying to preserve, and how might we be able to put a framework in place to preserve them. And we wanted to make sure that this conversation didn't die, and that we brought this to a larger group, in the preservation community to talk about, I mean, we're all aware of web archiving, we're all aware of interactives, we're all aware of software preservation. This is a particular category of public information that's been hard to sort of get our hands around as a category of object. And what can we do as a community with the journalism community and the researcher community to start preserving these objects, many of which were lost. At one point we said, let's throw out all the slides and just tell sad stories of loss. But it would be better if we actually talked about the survey and what we actually know about this.
Yeah, it seems like I'm so I'm a related listener. We were going around doing intros. I work for, I think it's Local News, which is a appendage of Mozilla that goes out and partners with news organizations, as well as developers, and we're vetted in the newsroom and we're supposed to help them with their technical difficulties and archiving, of course. So yes, that's what I do. But I work for HTV and News Kenya, and those are both operations based in East Africa. We do journalism education and data journalism projects and crowdsourced deployments of crisis mapping software. Right, so we're going to get into introductions. So what is Born Digital in the newsroom? What are news apps? I don't know if you guys want to take some of that and I can up some of that. Someone wants to define.
I count Born Digital, when I'm starting to look at Born Digital content, I would technically count that as content that was created on the electronic system, which those things have existed since the 70s. I don't think it was prior to that, not to my knowledge. That content probably isn't really available. If it is, it's probably very difficult to get into a format that we can use today. There's a lot more Born Digital content, I think, that we can access since the 1990s in terms of text. And then in terms of images, we're looking at the early to mid 1990s when digital photography got to the point where newspapers could utilize it. Of course, going on from there, video and other kinds of content that are produced on computers. And I won't talk about news apps so much because
Yeah, I think actually.
Yeah,
You had examples.
I have some examples of that too. So the part of the intro side was just to talk about how we're bridging with the closed source kind of older archive, old tradition, archiving newsprint and more digital news. And then also archiving news apps, which are more like interactive databases. So this is sort of, we're going to continue to see your survey results. Then I can move on.
sounds good. Okay, so the survey, well, first of all, when I started to look, as I assumed this new position, and I really started to dig into what's going on with Born Digital content at news organizations, I found out that actually there's not much information about that. We haven't really investigated that very well. So luckily, some of my friends at RJI came up with some funding for a phone survey. We pulled together a number of different lists of probably about 1,700 organizations in the United States. This is only for U.S.-based operations. 406 of those were what we call hybrids, which are sort of the legacy news operations. Usually we're talking about newspapers here, print operations that have an online presence. And then we also pulled together a new list, which was really hard to actually put together, of online-only news organizations. So we kind of split it that way. So we have the
Server sensor.
text.
Yeah, the different formats that are addressed.
Right. So, no, how well you can see the screen. I don't know how well I can see it. One of the reasons that I put this slide in terms of Born Digital text formats is that we've got the online only in blue and the hybrids in gold. You can see major differences in terms of the kinds of text formats that they're calling HTML a text format. We'll kind of look at that use of language. I think as we're going on, we'll see that we may not be using the same language, but we can sort of interpret it. I can see, okay, you're making it text, but maybe that's not quite what we would call a text format. Likewise, they're using Word. The legacy operations are more likely to be using something like XML, which probably means they're creating it in a content management system. For video formats, similarly, we have this issue of language. I personally wouldn't call YouTube a video format, but it's more of a presentation platform. Likewise, Brightcove is something that's been produced as a platform mostly for the legacy media people. So I think this may be the beginning of looking at, we have sort of disconnect between our culture and the culture in journalism. And language is one of those areas that we're going to have to think about when we're talking with as we try to bring news organizations and information scientists and libraries and memory institutions together.
And I think that some of the things that continues in the developer community too. These are examples of these apps of what I would classify as news apps, being interactive databases that news organizations put out online. The first one being ProPublica's Dollars for Docs, which allows you to kind of search and find out how drug money funding is leading into the diagnosis you're getting from your doctors. You can search by location, and they cleaned up all of their data and made it available online so that you can persistently search. But maintaining this database and updating it and everything is a constant effort. So whether they can allot journalists or developers to the project continuously, or if they have a plan for updating all of the different libraries and things, it depends on. That's the problem. And then the second one is the New York Times Interactive, which was the 512 pass of the White House, which is kind of a drop-down, the links there so you can explore the interactivity aspect of it. But it was for the election in 2012, and it allowed you to kind of guess based on state favoritism what president would be the victor, or what I guess candidate would be the victor for the presidency. But these are two different types of applications that are interactive that newsrooms haven't really figured out how they're going to archive or how they're going to maintain. The New York Times has some muscle behind it because they have funding, but smaller newsrooms or smaller operations who kind of subsist on grants or subsist on some other revenue stream that can't be solely devoted to preservation, can't really afford to do that. And then interactive formats, we put this into, because we talked about the text formats. True as well, the point earlier about HTML being a text format and ASCII and UTF-8 being separate from HTML and web. Web was another category, and web doesn't assume those things apparently. So just understanding how a developer would approach that kind of scheme or definitions of all those terms. And then here I think you can say that you can adopt in some different languages that they deal with their collections of independent. Is that what this is?
What was the question?
Oh, sorry. These language, dispersion of languages or more digital interactive formats, this is representative of what their dependencies are.
Well, these are the responses we're getting, and it's important to remember, first of all, that this is fairly preliminary information. We've gotten the raw data, and we're pulling it together. In some categories, maybe we should combine, but we're kind of dumping this out and saying, okay, here's where we are now. One of the things that's kind of interesting to me is, I guess I had a thought that online organizations were going to be these wildly high-tech, situations where people, all they're doing is creating apps, and their platform changes almost on a weekly basis, doing something new. And I don't see that so much in the data. I think it's a real combination, and a lot of the organizations are probably pretty small, and they're bootstrapping, and they're pulling together whatever resources they can. So they're not using as much HTML5. They're not. you know, in terms of social media, maybe it's just, again, a semantic thing. But the legacy organizations are saying, well, social format or social media is an interactive format, which I can kind of see, but not so much true of the online-only organizations. So I guess I'm just trying to peer into this glass and say, what's going on out there? Why are they thinking the way that they're thinking? Why are they giving you these responses?
Yeah, so the next one about why are these applications not preserving? Why is selections worth preserving? And we can also speak to some aspect of our experience that basically are from a research perspective. I think one interesting sort of niche about the news, which maybe is something that is shared by multiple communities, but because the news, it's contemporary, it's up to the minute, and if you're developing an application, you have 2 weeks to make it. You're not caring about how it's made, really, or how you're documenting how it's made. And you certainly don't care about how long it's sustainable after it goes up because you're already on to the next project. So most type news teams aren't really concerned with archiving or even documenting their things so they can be archived. So communicating with those teams about why that's important is something that we'll have to messages. So maybe you can all talk too about what is being archived and what are the biggest challenges based on your experience. Go down the line.
Yeah, and my perspective on this is limited actually in some ways from having focused so exclusively on audio and like having I worked as a print journalist for a little while myself, but like at such the beginning of that chain of command that, you know, I wasn't even fully keyed into what was going on at the organizations that I worked at. But I think the one thing that I see that is consistent across all of our experiences is that a lot of journalists or journalism organizations news organizations don't necessarily realize or have a well-formed definition of what an archive or archiving is. So they'll equate putting, for example, their broadcast pieces up on SoundCloud with, posterity. Yeah. And I think we see the same is true like newspapers and ProQuest. Well, it's ProQuest. It's an archive. So that's my little. And then just you speak to the slide before, anecdotally, briefly. I think as technology has become, to some extent, abstracted away more and more from the final output of the news itself. So, certainly there are developers writing this code, understanding it, but the number of people touching the news who actually see that code or understand it is very few. In comparison, when we've talked about this in the past, we've held up, like newspapers from the 18th century, the 1700s, when the Bill of Rights was ratified, showing how each state voted, and you could see how the actual letters were laid out on the letterpress, and how the person that did that put this little, curly bracket in here to help, and we don't know, we don't have an interview with that person or oral history saying why they made those design decisions, but you can see and understand the mechanics of a lot of that so much more easily, even if a lot of those print newspapers were lost. For what we have, it's accessible in a way that a code-based is around.
I mean, what we found talking to both journalists and software developers at the event in March at the museum was that, they had increasingly become responsible for archiving their own personal legacies because the news organizations were unfamiliar with what the scope of archiving was and what might be needed to archive it. I mean, getting to one of Edward's points about the infrastructure changing, what some of these journalists and software developers found was that they had developed an interactive for a particular news event, for a particular world event, and they thought it was safe with the organization. Then there was some sort of infrastructure migration. The dependencies were not documented. The dependencies were not known. The application didn't work anymore, and nobody checked that or noticed until the journalist or the software developer went back to reference their own work and found either a 404 that it wasn't available anymore, or it was still there but just didn't function anymore. And this burden was being put on the journalists and the developers to archive their own materials because no one else was looking at it.
I would just say big picture in terms of culture and looking at newspapers, radio, television, maybe online, that newspapers have the best or the longest tradition and the most well-developed tradition of holding their archives, building their archives, and valuing those, cultivating those. That may be slipping today. Radio seems like it's a real uphill battle to get people to do that, and as well as television, they may do a little bit more than radio.
You see the same patterns where, so like New York Times may have a librarian on staff and a certain strategy, and in the same way that WGTH has an open vault and an amazing, preservation strategy. But then as you look at the smaller and less well-resourced organizations, it's completely different.
Yeah, but it's also one of those issues of timeliness that Aurelia mentioned, that, the attention is paid to the interactive that is important right now for this event, and sometimes less attention is paid to, the ones in the past, because now there's something new to develop. I mean, we heard from a lot of the developers that they had to develop these things very quickly. They didn't necessarily have time to document them to the extent that they would want to or hope to. And then, they might have moved on to another news organization, and there was no one left who knew what it was.
So back to how people are approaching archiving. Henry's doing some of the certain results.
Okay, we're up with
Yeah, we're up to
the more digital news content that's backed up. So we asked people, like, what percentage of, and we broke this down more, but it was just kind of for effect. We said, okay, we had, 91% of online-only people and 77% of hybrid people saying that their news content is backed up. We didn't get into the specifics of what backup really means. And it was a pretty long phone survey, so forgive us for not digging in deeper, but I think our average time on the phone with these people was 17 minutes. And that's a long time to ask, especially of a news editor. And we definitely found out that the news editors are a tough crowd because they would email me with a correction to the way I had worded the question. Like, why are you asking me this question? This is the wrong question. But I love the fact that they were that engaged with it. I personally, as I go through, I want to pick this apart a little more, but this is what their perception is. Let's just put it that way. Okay, so they're feeling pretty comfortable about their backup. Then we ask them about their written policies for foreign digital news content, and okay, not so much, right? About 20% for online only, 26% for hybrid, and of course a lot of people don't know. My guess is that probably newspapers that are in chains, the larger organizations would tend to have more formal written policies, and the smaller organizations probably don't have a clue where to start with that. And this would reinforce the point that I'm feeling is that the smaller organizations are the ones where we're really seeing danger of loss. And there are, thousands and thousands of small news producers in small towns and rural areas that are just not equipped to deal with what's coming at them. And then again, the perception about insufficient policy, which we asked later, and it's a little bit daunting to say, no threat. Almost 40% of online-only organizations say we got nothing to worry about, and 22% of hybrids. So, what? Me worried? They're focused on what's coming. I mean, the nature of a journalist is to focus on what's coming immediately at me. How do I react to that? How do I process that? And then let me get on to the next thing. And I think that part of the culture is a real big difference between memory institutions and journalists that somehow we're going to have to reconcile.
Right, so current status, I guess, going on in the typical news archive. If there is one, we're going to get to whether news organizations have libraries later, but just address it.
Yeah, I mean, the radio stations primarily that we worked with at Pop-Up Archive are, like I said before, doing kind of ad hoc. There are a lot of things on hard drives at the station. There's rarely an archivist. It's usually news editors that are doubling, and it's usually the person who's worked there the longest who is doubling as that person, and holding a lot of kind of tacit knowledge and institutional memory with themselves. The documentation doesn't exist.
The engineers maybe.
Sometimes. I mean, and this also gets to one of the questions that Edward raised earlier about language. I mean, the definition of the word archiving means a lot of different things to different people in different contexts. And I think most of the people in this room, can stand up and say, backup is not archiving. Backup is not preservation. So a lot of organizations may, think they're doing archiving because they've got backups, but that's not really the same thing because there's a larger context, obviously, to archiving that is not just, I have this on a tape that I've taken off site. It's that I actually know what it is, what its components are, what its dependencies are, and this is actually archived and preserved and has a chance of running again in the future.
Everybody want to talk a little bit about the loss of,
Right,
the moment
so-
of loss, let's see.
A little bit about loss is that their perception of their loss is 17% of online-only organizations, which I should also think we don't necessarily have a way to track this, but I have to believe that they're online-only, so they can't have started before the World Wide Web and HTML. So we're talking mid-90s, and probably the institutional memory of hybrid organizations goes back farther. So I would say maybe they're roughly equal, or maybe online organizations are actually experiencing more loss than I think they are. And then we asked this question about whether or not the news organizations are sending their born digital content to memory institutions. And this is, of course, this is why we're here, and and sort of the reasons why. The specified question we'll have to dig into later, but there's the nothing in particular category. Don't know the institution, which 10% and 4%. Some people just don't want to hand their content over to anybody else. And then some people, 14% of people in online only and 9% of the hybrids said they don't know or not sure. In some ways, I think that's an opportunity. That what they're saying is we've got nothing in particular, don't know an institution, or don't know and not sure. That's an opportunity for us to reach out to them and educate them and tell them why we value what they've created and how we can help them. So I think there is a big opportunity there for us if we can get the message across and build trust with those organizations.
And so we're going to toggle back and forth between talking about larger newsrooms, smaller newsrooms, because I've already both the proposals kind of. So firstly, larger newsrooms, I just said the two examples here. One is the Times, New York Times has a Times machine that you can go back and explore their previous articles, and some of their interactives are available, but they have a lot of money in investing behind this and making it, and developers and staff to support it. And then Tyler Richard has a project, News Zero First project, which is a bunch of editors, their first interactive, so that when you're starting out as a developer in the newsroom, you can kind of lower the barrier a bit and realize that some people were making things look like trouble at one point. That it wasn't that ambitious, the interactives online, and most of them are broken. So that's the point here too, is that when you go and look at original editors' work, from 10 years ago, 5 years ago, not that long ago, we no longer have screenshots of them or access to them.
Yeah, this was one of those cases where we had some developers in the room who had built some of those interactives, and they wanted to contribute to, Newsner's first projects, and they went to grab them from the news organization where it had been put online, and it was no longer there or no longer worked. You know, and I think this is what's actually bringing on this desire to archive your own work as well, because they found they couldn't even contribute and share and say, hey, here's something about our history as a discipline, and I can't actually share it with you because it wasn't preserved.
And in our school newsroom soon, we talked a little bit about dependencies on vendors and requests to kind of take over the archival position. Most of the smaller newsrooms aren't paying attention to the interactives. They're not developing these applications or use search database. They're just wanting to make a database of their news content that they've been doing online for years, just regular, printed or reformatted for online publication. So one of the those project that was going on at the library I worked at previously, and it also brings up an interesting point that I worked in the basement archives, which are called the morgue. I think they're called the morgue in a lot of places, but it's a really morbid term. If we're talking about semantics, we've kind of dug a hole for ourselves with repository and morgue. It just seems like a place to go to die, doesn't it? And that's what people do, right? They look at, when you archive an email in Google, you lose it forever, and people use that excuse when they're responding to, like, I already archived it, I can't find it anymore. And that's not how an archive should be made, right? It's a searchable thing, and you can hopefully query and find things, but not use it forever. So maybe Amy talk a little bit about the design plan and how that developed and why we posted it, and then let's
Sure, yeah. So the Designathon, this is the app archiving Designathon. We realized that a hackathon was far too lofty a goal for a single day. Convened at the museum here in DC back in March. And it was sort of collaboration of the museum and the Pop-Up Archive and the Knightzilla Open News Fellows and Program, of which Riley is part. And we gathered, we had ticket registrations for journalists, educators, developers, and archivists. I may be missing one in there, but those were the major categories. And it was heavily balanced, balanced the direction of journalists. And I would say number 2 was developers. And then we had, like, Leslie was our archivist.
What was Aurelia?
Well,
Yeah, you count, sure. You still count. My pleasure. It's totally my authority, too.
And we did have someone from the internet.
And then Roger McDonald from the Internet Archive came as well. And especially as we think about ways that journalists can sort of take matters into their own hands to the degree that they're able. And then I think the other big part of this is trying to connect memory institutions and archivists and archival resources to journalists and news organizations more, which is part of why we wanted to be here talking about this today. The Internet Archive is a great resource in that they're willing to, their mission is to make a public archive of the web, and they'll take just about anything from anyone as long as it's public. And so it's true. So at Public Archive, for example, we partnered with them early on because, like I said, our big goal is to help preserve and create access to digital audio in a way that journalists could really easily integrate with their workflows, not have to spend a ton of time cataloging or thinking about the archive, because, to the anecdotes you just gave, it's like this black hole abyss that is always at the bottom of their list of priorities. As frustrating as that it is, we were like, okay, we're going to make this work. And so that has been a nice seamless way to save things like text files and images and audio files and video files. Part of the reason that we had Roger in the Designathon was to think about how we could save some of these much more complex applications and code. And so we split up into different groups and talked about developing a schema for news apps, and you can see some of it on this slide here. So defining the schema, looking at best practices, and that's my things. And then dependencies. So there's actually, and again, we'll put the bit.ly link up to this whole slide presentation at the end, but there's a GitHub repository that they published. Scott Klein from ProPublica was one of the kind of organizers of the Designathon with us. And so they've actually come up with different categories for code. I don't know if you can read it. There's data or input, story or output, infrastructure, process, response. So that's, Leslie, I don't know if you want to say more, but that's kind of how we started to start thinking about these very complex
Yeah,
as a
because
journalist.
there were definitely some assumptions that needed to be discussed in the room that day. Because there is, even working with a memory organization, a cultural heritage organization, if we, and any of my colleagues that work in web archiving know that even if we have archived something into a web archive, that doesn't mean that we can necessarily run it in the memory organization. And so a lot of our discussion that day was, what is it that we are archiving? What makes up a news app object to be archived, but also what are the expectations for the user experience in working with that preserved app in the future? Because, are we capturing just screen caps of how it worked along with the code and the underlying data in a database or in a flat file? Are we trying to just document that user experience? Are we trying to document how, the actual fully operational news app? That is sadly more often the case, not necessarily possible, because that requires those dependencies for, an operating system, for databases, for technologies, for rendering technologies that we don't necessarily have in, any of our institutions that run these, the Internet Archive.
Right. And we realized that given the alternative of like a broken code or a database that you can't access versus screenshots, like you may rather have the screenshots because it gives you a much better idea of what the thing actually looks like and how it relates.
Yeah, but of course, what we were also hearing from researchers that day was that while as much as we want to have the history of the discipline for the news apps and understand how the news app worked and what the user experience was, that we also want the underlying data set that drove that app, because understanding what data it was actually operating on and what data was actually being used to present this interactive and this information was also important. So we ended up having a very lengthy discussion of what's the preservation object, and it not surprisingly quickly grew from we want the app and the database and the documentation and the dependencies and all the documentation of the dependencies, and you ended up with a not always realistic list of what a perfect preservation object would be for a news app, but it was an incredibly, it's aspirational, but, we have a lot of conversation in this community about levels of preservation, and in some ways what we might be doing is bit preservation. We've got all the executables, we know what it was, we might know what it looked like, and we have the underlying data, but we may never be able to run it again. But that sort of bit preservation and documentation may have to be good enough, or often that is the only thing we can achieve.
I was going to say too, as a kind of a framework, as you say, is documentation, right? We're documentarians, but one of the things that we hoped to develop subsequent to the Presentalon was some kind of developer guides for developers working on a new team, that they can follow this as they're building their application, because realistically they're not going to revisit it and document afterwards every case. And documentation is the loathsome stepchild that no one wants to deal with on a developing team. There's actually a graphic that I was going to show, which maybe won't make as much sense, but I just described it. But it's a typical workflow for developers on any team. It shows what everybody in project management role, for example, in the development role, how they consider the product. And everyone has a different prototype for this tire swing. And the one that the developer sees doesn't really work because they built something that's broken. But then they have a slide or another frame that shows how the project was documented, and there's nothing. And then it shows how it was sold, and there's like a roller coaster that they pressed a roller coaster, and what the client actually needed was a tire swing. So it's completely different how different people's perspectives, but having the developer actually document what languages they're using and what their dependencies are will help whoever tries to archive it later. Otherwise you have to retrospectively kind of use it for forensics to figure out what was going on, and that's just so time consuming. Right, so we kind of went over some of these, some of the outputs, the resources and the schema and everything. We kind of talked about those a bit. And then we also addressed the idea that most of these newsrooms, or news apps developers would kind of develop their own schema, their own process, and didn't really think to consult the archive community or haven't really worked closely with them, and most people don't have these libraries.
Yeah. Well, I think what's important about this slide, and it's showing that 6% of online only and 21% of hybrids do have a news librarian. And then those giant bars to the right of that are the 94% of online do not, and 79% of hybrids. I'd like to kind of see this over time. I wish I had data about, I think there are a few data points about news librarians, but it's got to be like this. Part of that is due to cost cutting. Some of that I think is also, there's kind of this dynamic that as like in the 80s and the 90s, as we moved into electronic systems, that our expectation was that these systems were going to be able to do everything and more that a human being could do. And that we were, the executives were probably sold that, the news organization sold that bill of goods. And it was a very attractive, the IT department was very happy to say, oh, we can handle that. I mean, we're information technologists. So, I think gradually the role of a library professional in the news organization has been diminished. It's really unfortunate. And I think I'm hoping to help make a case that is in the long term a mistake, but we've got short-term goals of the news organization, and if you're in a corporation, the next quarter's profits may override the idea that you're going to need someone to help you sort out this content in another 5 years. When you need to do a story about this bond issue that was sold to the public, for instance, and the bonds, the project is double the cost that it was supposed to be. Well, where do you go? How do you find that information about what you were told 5 years ago? Where's a reliable source of that information?
And the speed with which news online changes and is versioned is very fast. I mean, when I was still at LC, we did some experimental work with some news organizations in web archiving we did a couple of pilots and looking at Abby. But what we found, certainly with the larger news organizations, was that what was online changed every few seconds in some cases. And what is it that is archived and captured? And does that all go into their CMS? Does it not go into their CMS? And even if we were trying to do web archiving on this, it's very hard. You might get one snapshot a day, but is that, when was the day, done? When was the news over for that day? It isn't anymore.
No.
And so that was a very hard thing. Abby, do you want to?
Just thinking about, we were doing it in terms of what might a copyright deposit be like, and whether our callers going out and getting it was a strange thing, because we were determining the snapshot time, rather than news organization saying, this is the thing I want to register.
Or they might have told us, we only want you to get our content, not anything else on the news site. So what does that, mean in terms of newswire content, or user-supplied content, or social media interactions, advertising? I'm looking at, Deb Thomas from the Serials Division at LC, and one of the questions was, there's the whole news context. How does capturing a news site similar to capturing a newspaper, where you get the whole context of the news and how it appeared that day and what it was related to, and where did it appear above or below the fold, or was it on the front page or in section C32, in terms of importance. And it was a really hard thing to get at. How do you capture that from online?
That is true. And some of those pieces are the pieces that are the most valuable to the historical researchers, or as valuable as the actual news articles. And that is something very difficult to convey to news providers, is that the ads are as valuable to researchers, the obituaries, and all of those services are now being, the classifieds, are now being run by third-party services, and they don't either own the data, or it's in a format that we can't isolatedly access to tie to that newspaper or news site. And then there's the issue of Best edition has always been an issue, the edition copy, the copy of record. That's something that libraries and/or newspapers are always going to decide. So that goes back to the question of versioning and things like that. We have to make compromises someplace, but we have to figure out who's willing to compromise where.
As you look across different formats, right, looking at the copy of record, and context, wanting to see the news as it was presented with the advertising. I mean, the most successful ad tech companies today are just coming up with new ways to add layers around content with advertising. So there's it's just gets worse every day.
And what you see and what I see on the same page at the same moment will be different, because we have different cookies set in our browsers. I mean, I might have recently been shoe shopping and you might have been cookware shopping.
We're on opposite
We're
coasts.
going to see a different page at the exact same second. So how do you say what the context is?
So, we also talked in our brief sessions before this about different models for engaging other communities to support what is already going on in the news community and news archiving, and also about the potential for monetization or how we could possibly support it financially. So I don't know if you guys want to chime in with perspectives on that based on your.
This is the thing that I think that I'm most, that I think is most important, is that we need to reach out to the news organizations. We need to build community with the news organizations. We are very interested in it. We're standing on tiptoe to work on this. And yeah, we're really having a hard time getting across to, our message to journalists. Another part of community, I think, is to look at situations, especially with the small papers, which I think are really endangered, is can we assist local libraries with tools and with knowledge to help preserve their local newspapers? Because there's already a trust there that's because they're already in the same community. To me, that would be a natural kind of partnership, or maybe including in that mix if there's a community foundation, or I don't know, the Kiwanis, the Optimist Club. I don't care, how we get it done, but somehow we need to really have a community that with journalists so that they understand what we're talking about, and we have a sense of what they're talking about. And we may be, I get a sense that in some ways we maybe think that we know everything. And if you approach journalists with that attitude, that's a non-starter. Because journalists know everything. Right? They're reporters, they're God, they're editors, they're above God. My little spiel on that. I think it's really important.
I think there are going to be a lot of mixed emotions and reactions to the word monetize. I mean, archiving is an activity that requires financial support to do, but there are a lot of people, especially in cultural heritage organizations, that want to see everything free and open, and a lot of researchers that want to see it free and open, but it's not, and it can't necessarily be. I mean, think about how the web archiving through paywall, and that was not yet. I saw the look on Abby's face when I said that, because it was not always a successful archiving through a paywall. But then we also understand, it's like, well, there's a paywall because they can't afford to do this unless they get some monetization and income from this somehow.
Newspapers are going under because they can't make money. So they're desperate for any source of revenue. And so they're kind of afraid that if they let go of this archival material, that they may be losing an opportunity. On the other hand, they're afraid to make the investment in there to actually reap the potential benefits of the archives. They're kind of in this double bind, at least a double bind, if not more. That's why I think public-private partnerships or outside organizations coming in and trying to assist the news organizations is a good idea.
Right. So what are your side about the value archive?
Right. slide. So we asked, some of the questions we asked were about values and how people looked at archives and in terms of the return on investment. I think it's a good, kind of a nice curve that goes up on the right side, which is that it's very valuable. I would say, but if you look at that return on investment compared to the highest value, which is just basically the quality of the journalism that they produce, that's the values are probably more than double on that end. So they recognize that to produce the kind of product they want to produce, they need the archive. They're still worried and they're still unsure, how does the archive really provide a return on investment? And that may be why librarians are being cut. They see this as a cost center instead of an opportunity. And it's not just monetary. I would argue that if a news organization has been in a community for a long time, and they are the source of information for the community, they're the holders of the cultural heritage there to a large extent, that's a great position to be in as an organization, that you build a relationship with the community, and that relationship can, if you do it right, it can translate into a monetary return. But it's not right in front of them, so it's hard to push this.
So I think we also talked about how we develop something that's flexible enough so that it supports both the smaller papers and then larger institutions and can serve as a more generic standard, but also has like different avenues you can go down if you want to get more specific granular what your needs are. This is so we've already kind of talked through the definition of the archivist, but I found this interesting and I was searching for graphics because I wanted to bring up the text. I searched on the Now Project for archive and this popped up, which is also cross-referenced as overworks. Yeah, it's possible that that's kind of blended with our fusion definition of what an archive is. We kind of gone over it laboriously, and I'm sure I think I've seen it in a couple of library talks too. People are always talking about how the changing definition of archive has made it more difficult to understand why it's a necessary thing to invest in. Values are historic quality journalism, and we want to touch on those.
Well, that's what I was comparing to the earlier slide, and you can see that there's a huge percentage that say it's either valuable or very valuable, especially, and most of them very valuable, 74% online only, 71% hybrid. Value it for the quality of their journalism. And I would say that's a good thing, because I think we value that too. We do share that. So where can we find common ground? This is hopefully an area where we can convince them that we are friends, we're not trying to steal their stuff, take it away from them, that we have common values.
I think the value is evidenced when news organizations can point to specific examples of times that archival content has served them well. And I know, like, one of my favorite lines from the leaked New York Times, I have to keep repping the New York Times, I don't know why that's the example we keep going through, but in the innovation report that got leaked a few months back, one of my favorite lines in it was, like, the New York Times could be doing a much better job of leveraging their archival content. And like one of our most popular pieces of content this year was something like BuzzFeed repackaged, having gone through the New York Times archive, right? And so missing those opportunities sometimes, like that, the pain of missing that, I think, can be a great incentivizer. And then, like with the radio stations that I've worked with and spoken with, they also want to be relevant in these moments when, a famous person dies or something is in the news. They can very quickly go back and have a scoop on, basically, but don't.
I think the same case too for these apps, not even just the investigative reports that talk about elections or about crises around the world, but even NPR, you referenced like radio stations, so NPR did I was talking to Edward about this earlier, did an interactive application to explore all of the themes in Arrested Development. A show that I've never watched, but I've been part of a pub trivia group, and there is always working on was just trying to archive and digitize all of its news content, digitize all of the stuff that wasn't digitized, and then also archive that in tandem with all the things that were digital. And then on the left, you see like the large newsroom. This is the two other examples. But one of them is the Kepler Tally of Planets Exploration Interactive. That was really beautiful and stunning, but they have to also support and post that continuously. And then at the bottom, you can't really tell that it's distinct. I should have made that more distinct. The state secrets reference was all of the Snowden files and the Chelsea Manning case files, and now they're becoming the sources of these repositories of information for research. So figuring out how they're going to best develop a schema to archive those and how we can support that initiative would be wonderful. So we also talked too about how some of the organizations, I think I reworded this in a more diplomatic way, but feel trapped by their CMS. So yeah, if you want to speak to that briefly, maybe.
I would just say really quickly that I think we should recognize that the CMS vendors have a long-standing relationship with the news organizations, and that in a lot of cases they are they're the real holders of the content. They're the real key to that kingdom, and so I think they need to be involved in the conversation as well.
Yeah, because we very much heard when we were doing our web archiving and looking at, what is it that we would like to bring into the collection to preserve. We often, over and again and again and again, heard, well, we can't actually export that for you in a way that you can preserve because our CMS doesn't support that. So somebody's got to go to our vendor and tell them what the specification is and convince the vendors to help us produce what memory organizations can preserve.
Yeah. And we also talked a bit about public-private partnerships, and we kind of mentioned that in the conversation. And the New York Times Scoop application and how they're approaching archiving. There's other applications like Servo, I think, that we're not going to address, but we should, as a GitHub, as kind of like version control for news. There are pros.io and editorially who've also attempted news versioning, so that they adopt the GitHub model of allowing you to track changes and automate documentation so that you can follow the trajectory of your applications.
Didn't editorially just show its doors?
No, it didn't, because it got refunded, I think, by the education. So, yeah. Or someone else refunded it. Some angry or retweet.
But that's not necessarily a long-term.
It's not, like
sustainable
most, I was just talking to someone out there about how it would be really great if, a lot of my friends who went to library school with me are kind of on grant-funded positions, and there's no real desire to invest strongly in whatever archive you're working on. If you know you only have a job for 6 months, and then 5 months into that, you need to look for another job. So kind of getting buy-in and just investment from the librarians themselves who are devoting themselves to these projects is hard. Because grant funding is so precarious, and so there are some people dependent on it in terms of developing these new applications or approaches to archiving. And also talk about that, don't a lot of funding.
Yeah. I mean, in many ways, that's like at the absolute heart of Pop-Up Archive's mission and existence is we won the Night News Challenge in 2012. We've been funded to our great delight by the Endowment for the Humanities, but we don't want it to just run out. And so building a business model around helping organizations archive their news is very much our work. And it's hard, but it's also, we're 2 years in and it's working. So we're enthused about it. But this ROI, what is the value of your archive? The ROI for, why you would even care about this in the first place is a big part of it. And then in our case, speeding up active production workflows is a big part of it too. So look, what you publish right now is archival 5 minutes from now. So let's think about this as part of making archiving part of the production workflow has kind of been our thing from the beginning. Yeah.
Well, then I'm going to skip to the next one because it talks more about, we kind of already put address monetization. I'm not sure if we want to revisit that. Before in terms of the CMS and how there are these dependencies that we're going to create less dependencies on the partnership.
We're on the revenue generation side. So we just asked about if news organizations were using vendors like ProQuest or Newsbank, and it's kind of a little bit surprising to me that there's only 34% of hybrids and 11% of online onlys that said yes. Part of that may be due to size, due to longevity, but I think there's also, there's a little bit of a problem with the business model there. And personally, I see that as an opportunity to do something that's better. It's better for the news organization, it's better for libraries and the public. So I want to make sure we have some time to
Yeah,
talk.
I was gonna say, I think let's skip to these next really quickly, like add to the future practicing. Most of the are to address some upcoming issues, and I think a lot of most of the library community are aware of the upcoming issues, but in terms of news, future media that you might have to preserve in terms of like, application to for particular devices, for mobile, for Google Glass, for Oculus Rift, games that are collaborative, that require user input, how do you archive that experience? And then there's all of the increasingly abbreviative leaks and breaches in preservation documents that everyone wants to use Document Cloud or Overview to process and then make available to everyone online and make them persistently available as archival material that people can reference later. The Frequent Press Foundation builds SecureDrop, for example, that's another, and then a whole suite of tools actually that are meant to help journalists or enable them to correct those kind of breaches. And then we talk about smaller papers, you know, the smaller before, we talk about maybe building news co-ops to support smaller paper archival efforts, and maybe regional ones, and enabling different media archives. We talk mostly about print journals and more about text-based things, but we also have audio, TV, and broadcast that can, you know, works with exclusively, and we need to support that too, and then develop partnerships. And I put the music in because unions, you know, that's all unionized time. Anyway, so these are the takeaways. Again, we'll have the links, will also make them available, but we hope to open it up to maybe like 10 minutes of questions or 8 minutes of questions, as it turns out. And you can come up if you want and have a mic or you can shout. I think that's,
The 500 organizations that you surveyed, what list was that based on? Is it a membership list or how did you find them?
It was a list that is largely composed from the American Society of News Editors, which is also based in the journalism industrial complex in Columbia. And so I relied heavily on them. But there's a number of different, I think, sources that we use to compile it.
This is kind of a specific question, and I wonder if you got any insight into it in your conversations with your editors and people. One of the things that's happened is that news has kind of developed this reference layer behind it with the rise of video. So whereas once upon a time you would see very brief snippets from a long interview or a press conference, quoted in an article or shown in a television news program. Now you've often got the option to go watch the entire press conference, sit through the entire congressional hearing, enjoy 5 hours of interview with this political figure that they've helpfully reduced down to 10 minutes, that kind of thing. So there's now a whole lot of reference material out there that's kind of part of the news by implication. And the practices around that vary a lot. Sometimes it's viewed as very much the property, if you will, of the news organization. For example, a lengthy interview one-on-one that's been excerpted. Other times it's kind of pooled material, like maybe a press conference of a sports event or something like that. Are there policies about taking responsibility for that, copying it before Linkrod sets in, about where you kind of draw the boundaries around the collection of news that's part of your paper or your website or whatever, and how that ties into the preservation picture?
I think from our cases, not many of our experiences.
Yeah, I would think maybe that's a pretty tall order for an organization. Maybe the New York Times would be an organization that would think that far ahead. but I would say majority of, certainly smaller papers are not going to be thinking that way. The metros vary, but I think they're mainly, again, they're mainly interested with getting it up, and in some cases that means they're putting it up raw because they don't want to deal with editing it. They don't want to spend the money and the time to edit.
Do you think maybe that news outlets who have as their heritage television, for example, and have now expanded out into these hybrid television, that they just look at it differently?
I think they do. I had an experience with a television station archive where they had actually retained the, the edited on-air version, the original raw version, any other versions, the transcript of what was actually broadcast, the original script, which was not necessarily broadcast. So they were actually thinking more of what are all of the pieces that made this up. I had at one point worked with a production company that did the same thing for a TV series, for the whole run of the series. And what we got were all of those component parts. So they were already thinking of that as part of their workflow for how they produced it, and then they had a responsibility to keep all of those component parts over time and not get rid of them. So I think the ones coming from television as part of their heritage do think about it a little differently. But I can also, addressing, the question about, that reference layer, when we were doing this web archiving, we were working with a very large newspaper. We worked with a group of newspapers of varying sizes. And this issue of ownership came up very much. And they felt that they did not own or have a right to everything, rightly or wrongly, and because so much of it was licensed or streamed or hosted or, a service run by a third-party company that hosts all the obituaries for everybody. They knew they didn't own it, and they were very cautious about archiving it because they didn't want to be accountable for something that they didn't own or have something done with something they didn't own. So that very much came, the intellectual property aspect was very clear to them.
They could also missed tagged things in their system though.
Yes.
So,
Oh, yes.
there were all sorts of typos and misidentifications, so we were trying to use some tag that they had said, use that tag to identify our content versus other content, and it was often wrong, so it's tricky.
Can I ask you a question? Can I ask a show of hands of how many people here have personal contact with a news producing organization? Okay.
Who's the first in a professional role, you mean?
Right, yeah, as an archival professional.
American reporter.
So,
Yeah. That's what I wonder what you mean.
So that was actually my question. Is there any effort to try to connect these smaller news organizations to related or tangential archives and libraries to try to help them?
there have been. I know that University of Kentucky has an agreement with the Kentucky Press Association, and I think University of North Texas has some agreements with Texas Press Association. I don't know if there's one or two of those in Texas. It's such a big state. So there's some efforts to collect news content. I think generally right now what those are PDF artifacts basically from the production process or the print version of the newspaper. And so there's value there, but we should also know that acknowledge that we're missing some things that are probably going online that may not make it in the print edition or are different. So I think I personally am working with the Missouri Press Association now to do an experiment to see how many of their members would be interested in having their content archived and what kind of services they would like to see, and then also what kind of opportunities there are for that content to eventually be marketed as like a co-op.
You should mention a conference coming up this fall too. It's in a more general sense. You're speaking to this.
Right, yeah. RJI is hosting a conference website. We have a limited number of scholarships available, and if you're deeply interested in this topic, see me or contact me, send me an email, whatever. My first priority, I haven't really pounded at the memory organizations because I think we're on board. I'm focusing marketing efforts on journalists right now, trying to drag them by the ear, to come and be here. And so I'm really calling on all the journalists and all the researchers at the university to try to make that happen. Those people need to be there, and we need to find champions in journalism that can be at the table with us. Peter.
Yeah, boy, this is a huge mess. To restate the obvious. So a couple of things occurred to me. One is that archiving the finished product is impossible. External dependencies on data, embedded content, personalization, rapid change, external dependencies on code, it's not possible in my view. But I think the place to start is that in some of your opening slides there seemed to be no appreciation or no understanding of the various stacks that these organizations are building and how they differ from each other. The original reporting stack and how that compares with the publication stack and the recombining, remixing other people's materials. And it seems like the path forward starts with clarity about understanding what the organization is doing, the value proposition of reporting and original content generation, and how to see that differently from this ephemeral, ever-changing published product.
Agreed.
Yes.
Yeah, I think we need to sort it out. Where are we going to put our resources? Because we have, these vast collections and a large amount of text and things that might be relatively simple if we just had the right system to save them, to preserve them. But is that a priority? I think everybody has to be at the table to decide that.
There were such a thing as the right system, the one system to rule them all. It doesn't exist.
What you were pointing about when the question was asked about where are there partnerships currently with libraries and news organizations, and there are, but they're ad hoc and they're usually somebody inherits the archival content, that's what we build the illegal stuff, because the newspaper basically just came and said, we don't want to do all this, we're dumping it on you. And we're like, okay, we'll make an archive. That's what we do. But this is after the fact, right? This is not in real time. So Anne's talking about how you approach the developers while they're making it like documents now, so that we can archive it immediately. And that kind of getting in there right away and talking about archiving early isn't happening. It's more like you get the great dump from somebody else's organization when they can't do it anymore. And then it's the mess that it is.
Getting the word that it's time for lunch.
It's lunchtime.